They called him the King of Kings, the ruler of a world that stretched from the burning sands of Egypt to the frozen edges of the Persian plateau. But behind the marble pillars of Persepolis, behind the golden gates where the scent of myrrh filled the air, lay a truth so dark that even history dared to whisper it. Xerxes the Great, the man who commanded legions, who burned Athens to the ground, and who bent nations to his will, could not conquer one thing: the demons within his own palace. And what he did to his harem, to the daughters who bore his blood and name, would echo as one of the most chilling chapters of Persian history. When Xerxes ascended the throne, in 486 BC, Persia stood as an empire unmatched in wealth and power. His father, Darius the Great, had built it with discipline, law, and administration. Xerxes, however, inherited not just the throne, but a burden, a restless desire to prove that he was greater than his father, greater than any mortal who had ever lived. He saw himself not merely as king, but as divine. The Persians called him Kushiathatea, Kushiathateum, the King of Kings, and he believed it. Yet, divinity has its cost, and in Xerxes' world, even blood was currency. The royal harem of Xerxes was unlike anything else in the ancient world. It wasn't merely a place of pleasure, but a fortress of politics, power, and fear. Within its marble walls lived hundreds of women, princesses taken as tokens of peace, concubines offered by defeated rulers, and noble daughters raised under the shadow of submission. Each of them was bound by silence, by the cruel decorum of the Persian court that turned beauty into weaponry and motherhood into strategy. Among them were his own daughters, women of royal birth, raised to carry the lineage of the Achaemenid dynasty. Yet in that gilded cage, even they were not safe from their father's wrath or madness. Xerxes was a man consumed by contradictions. To his people, he was a god on earth, majestic, untouchable, the very embodiment of Persian glory. But within his palace, he was haunted by paranoia and obsession. His disastrous campaign in Greece, where his grand army, the largest the world had ever seen, was humiliated at Salamis, had fractured something inside him. Every defeat, every whisper of betrayal, drove him deeper into cruelty. He began to see enemies everywhere in his generals, in his advisors, and even in his own bloodline. The fall of Xerxes' sanity began slowly, quietly. After his return from Greece, he withdrew from the affairs of empire, leaving governance to courtiers and eunuchs. The once proud king, who had stood before legions and roared commands over the thunder of drums, now spent his days wandering the labyrinth of his palace. The harem became his refuge and his curse. It was said that Xerxes began to visit the women not as their lord, but as a man desperate to drown his humiliation. The court scribes avoided recording these moments, but the whispers carried through corridors and across centuries. Xerxes' passions turned violent, his affections cruel. The line between love and power had vanished. One of the first to feel his wrath was Artainte, the daughter of his brother Mes. She was young, radiant, and forbidden. But Xerxes' desire knew no law, not even that of his own family. When he saw her during a royal procession, legend says he was struck by her resemblance to his late queen Amest. She had the same dark eyes, the same poise, but unlike a maestress, Artainte was untamed, curious, alive. Against all propriety, Xerxes took her as his lover, defying both custom and blood. The scandal spread through the court like wildfire, and when Amastris learned of it, her fury was beyond measure. What followed would stain the empire in shame. In an act of cold vengeance, Amastris ordered the mutilation of Artainte's mother, her flesh torn, her body destroyed, simply for giving birth to a daughter the king desired. The cries of that night, it is said, were heard through the marble halls. Xerxes watched, not as a husband or a father, but as a god enforcing the divine order of his house. In that moment, the boundary between justice and cruelty was erased. His daughters, who had once looked upon him as protector and king, now saw something else, a tyrant whose love was more terrifying than hate itself. The harem became a palace of silence. The women spoke only in whispers, their eyes lowered whenever the king entered. Fear had replaced ceremony. Xerxes' daughters, born of royal blood yet chained by their father's madness, lived like ghosts within their own home. Ancient sources, like Ctesias of Cnidus, would later describe the atmosphere of the Persian court as a place where a smile could cost a life. Those who pleased the king were exalted for a night and forgotten by dawn. Those who defied him vanished. And yet, the deeper tragedy lay not in Xerxes' cruelty, but in his isolation. The man who once commanded half the known world now ruled only shadows and fears. His mind, poisoned by failure and pride, turned against itself. He saw betrayal in the eyes of his own daughters, women who had done nothing but bear the name he had given them. History remembers that Xerxes had several daughters, Amytis Rhodogun, and perhaps others unnamed, but their fates remain obscured, erased by the empire's silence. Some say they were married off to distant satraps to secure loyalty. Others claim that they were kept within the palace until death, silenced by the king's paranoia. Whatever the truth, their stories ended in darkness. In the twilight of his reign, Xerxes' palace grew colder. The golden tapestries faded. The laughter that once filled the gardens died away. Servants moved like ghosts. Eunuchs spoke only in hushed tones. The harem, once a symbol of Persian grandeur, had become a tomb of living memories. Xerxes, drunk on both power and regret, began to lash out without reason. He accused his own sons of conspiracy, his daughters of deceit. Some chroniclers write that he even ordered the execution of servants for whispering his name at night. It was during these final years that Xerxes' legacy as the god king truly perished. His actions toward those closest to him revealed the hollowness of his crown. The empire he once ruled with an iron fist began to fracture under his neglect. Rebellions broke out in Bactria, Babylon, and Egypt. The once great Achaemenid machine was rusting from within. Corroded by its master's madness, Xerxes died in 465 BCE, not on the battlefield, but in his own bed, slain by a conspiracy within his palace. It was Artabanus, his own guard commander, who plunged the dagger into the chest of the man once called divine. Some say it was revenge for years of tyranny. Others say it was mercy to end the suffering of a king who had already destroyed everything he loved. When his body was laid to rest in the tomb carved high into the cliffs of Naxxiras, the empire mourned publicly, but within the palace walls, there was only relief. Because behind the marble and the myths, behind the grand titles and inscriptions, Xerxes was not the god he claimed to be. He was a man, brilliant, broken, consumed by his own hunger for power. And in the end, the ones who paid the price for his greatness were not his enemies on the battlefield, but the daughters of his own blood, whose suffering remains a silent scar on the legacy of the Achaemenid Empire. Power has a way of rotting from the inside, and in the twilight of Xerxes' reign, the rot spread like an infection, unseen at first, but unstoppable. The court of the Achaemenid Empire, once a masterpiece of order and authority, became a maze of deceit, betrayal, and silent terror. Servants no longer spoke the truth, advisors no longer offered counsel, and even the air inside Persepolis grew heavy with fear. Xerxes, the king of kings, had turned his palace into a kingdom of whispers, a place where every word could be a death sentence, and every shadow a spy. After the scandal of Artaint and the vengeance of Queen Amastris, the royal harem was never the same. The halls that once shimmered with silk and laughter were now filled with tension, so thick it felt alive. The harem had always been more than a dwelling of women. It was the empire's hidden court, a political engine powered by beauty, secrets, and alliances. But now, that engine had turned against itself. Every concubine, every maid, every daughter of royal blood had learned a cruel truth. In Xerxes' world, love was not protection. It was the most dangerous weapon of all. As months turned into years, Xerxes grew older, heavier, and crueler. The defeat in Greece still haunted him. In his mind, the faces of the fallen, his soldiers drowned in foreign seas, his generals slain or disgraced, merged with the faces of those around him. He began to see betrayal in the eyes of everyone he knew. Even his own reflection became a stranger. It is said that he would wander the halls at night, speaking to himself, muttering orders to ghosts of his past victories. He cursed the gods who had abandoned him, then proclaimed himself divine again in the same breath. His pride and despair were indistinguishable now, two sides of the same broken coin. Among those who suffered most in these final years were his daughters. The royal daughters of Persia, Amytas, Rhodigune, and the others history has forgotten, had once been symbols of the empire's future. They were taught diplomacy, grace, and command. Their marriages could unite satrapies, secure alliances, or calm rebellion. But as Xerxes' paranoia deepened, he refused to let them leave the palace. He feared their husbands might conspire against him, that their sons might grow into rivals. So he kept them close, locked behind carved cedar doors, gilded in gold but stripped of freedom. Amytas, the eldest, had inherited her father's sharp mind and her mother's burning pride. She watched the empire crumble from the inside, saw the ministers grow fat with corruption while the king rotted in isolation. She saw her mother Amastris grow cold and bitter, her love for Xerxes twisted into obsession, and she saw her sisters suffer in silence, their days spent weaving tapestries for a kingdom that no longer existed beyond the palace walls. The harem became a world of its own, a prison disguised as paradise. The scent of incense masked decay, and the songs of slave musicians could not drown the echoes of grief. The eunuchs who served the harem became the only voices of the outside world, and even they spoke in riddles, careful not to offend unseen ears. In that suffocating silence, the daughters of Xerxes began to turn inward to one another. It is said that Amytas began to record her thoughts in secret, writing on thin strips of papyrus smuggled by a loyal servant. Those writings, if they ever existed, were lost to time. But the stories passed down through generations suggest that she spoke of her father not as a god or a king, but as a tragedy. She wrote that the greatest cruelty was not what he did in anger, but what he allowed in fear. He had become a man so obsessed with power that he destroyed the very things that gave him reason to hold it. In those final years, Xerxes' paranoia reached new heights. The guards of the harem were doubled. The women were forbidden to meet outsiders, even the royal tutors who once educated them. When one of his younger daughters fell ill, Xerxes refused to let the court physicians see her, fearing poison. She died within weeks. Some say he wept that night, not for her life, but because he believed her death was a divine punishment. The empire began to crumble faster than anyone realized. Outside the palace, rebellions were stirring. Egypt had risen again, defying Persian rule. The satrap of Bactria had begun plotting independence. The roads that once carried tribute from distant lands were now filled with soldiers and deserters. Yet within the palace walls, Xerxes refused to listen. He surrounded himself with flatterers who fed him illusions that the gods still favored him, that his empire was eternal, that his enemies were mere insects. His daughters watched in despair as their father sank deeper into delusion. One night, legend says Amytis confronted him. She found him sitting before a brazier, staring into the flames as if searching for answers in the fire. His once mighty frame had withered, his beard unkempt, his eyes hollow. She knelt beside him and whispered words that history never recorded. Some say she begged him to release his daughters from confinement. Others claim she cursed him for what he had done to their mother, their sister, and their people. Xerxes did not answer. He only stared into the fire, a king who had conquered the world, yet could not face the empire of his own heart. In the days that followed, something changed in the harem. The guards noticed a shift in the air, quieter than usual, yet heavier. The women spoke less, but their eyes burned brighter. Perhaps it was Amytis's defiance that sparked it. Or perhaps it was the slow realization that the empire outside no longer mattered. What mattered was survival, the preservation of their dignity, their memories, and their truth. The daughters of Xerxes began to act not as captives, but as keepers of a dying legacy. They would gather in secret during the late hours. After the torches dimmed, there, among the columns and the moonlight, they whispered stories of what once was, of Darius's justice, of the conquests that had built their dynasty, of the promise Persia once held. Those whispered tales became acts of rebellion, for in a world where even speech was controlled, memory itself became resistance. But Xerxes was not blind forever. He began to suspect that the women in his harem were plotting something, though in truth, they plotted nothing more than to remember. His paranoia twisted that memory into treachery. In one infamous outburst, he ordered that all letters, records, and gifts belonging to the royal women be destroyed. The harem's archives, the personal writings of queens and princesses stretching back decades, were burned in a courtyard fire. The ashes rose into the Persian night like the souls of the forgotten. That night, Amytis is said to have stood at her window and watched the smoke drift toward the stars. For the first time, she understood the true curse of power, not that it corrupts, but that it consumes everything it touches, even those who never sought it. Her father had not merely destroyed an empire, he had destroyed history itself, erasing the women whose stories might have humanized him. By now, Xerxes had become a shadow of the man who once stood before his armies at Thermopylae and demanded the surrender of nations. His victories were ghosts, his palace a tomb. His daughters became his only audience, silent, terrified witnesses to a god's slow death. Each passing day seemed to peel away another layer of his sanity, and yet, even in his madness, there was a flicker of humanity left. There are tales, faint, almost mythical, that in his final months, Xerxes called for Amytis one last time. He looked upon her and saw not a subject, but his child. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. The man who had once commanded thousands could no longer command his own tongue. Some say he wept, not for his empire, but for what he had done to those who bore his name. But history does not forgive easily. The empire outside was collapsing faster than anyone dared admit. Corruption rotted the city. The treasury bled dry. The soldiers were unpaid. When Xerxes was finally assassinated by his own guards, the empire barely noticed. The women of the harem heard the commotion, the sound of hurried footsteps, the muffled cries of servants, and then silence. For a moment, they did not know whether to weep or to breathe. The King of Kings was gone, and with him, the nightmare that had ruled their lives. Amytis and her sisters would live on in the shadows of their father's legacy, unrecorded, unnamed, forgotten by the very history they helped witness. But their silence became its own monument, a quiet testament to endurance. The Achaemenid Empire would endure for another century, but the stain of Xerxes' reign would never fade. His victories turned to ruins, his glory to legend, and his cruelty to warning. Because in the end, what Xerxes did to his own bloodline was not merely an act of power. It was a mirror, one that showed the world that even the greatest of kings, when blinded by pride and fear, can become prisoners of their own throne. The death of Xerxes should have marked the end of tyranny. Yet in Persia, death was never the end. It was merely a transfer of shadows. When the King of Kings was struck down in his own palace, his empire did not mourn as it once would have. There were no grand parades, no chants of divine glory. The marble courtyards of Persepolis were eerily quiet, save for the soft wails of those who had served him all their lives. Even the gods, it seemed, had grown silent. The empire that Xerxes had once ruled through fear now trembled in uncertainty. As if the land itself was holding its breath, Artabanus, the very man who had murdered him, declared that he acted to save Persia from ruin. But history is never that clean. In truth, Artabanus had simply replaced one kind of ambition with another. He sought to control the throne, through Xerxes' surviving sons, Artaxerxes and Darius, pitting them against each other in a cruel game of manipulation. The palace that had been a theater of paranoia under Xerxes now became a battlefield of succession, and in the midst of this chaos stood the daughters of the dead king, women burdened with a name that had become both curse and crown. Amit, the eldest, understood that her father's ghost would haunt every corridor of the empire. She had lived long enough within his shadow to know how power devours truth. When Artaxerxes seized the throne, after killing his brother, she realized that history would soon repeat itself, that blood would once again be the empire's price for peace. The new king vowed to restore order, to bring justice where his father had brought madness. But the sins of Xerxes ran deep, and no decree could wash them away. The Achaemenid court, poisoned by years of deceit, had forgotten what loyalty even meant. In the heart of Persepolis, the harem still stood, a relic of the old order. Many of the women within had aged into quiet specters of a forgotten age. The laughter of youth had been replaced by whispers of survival. The daughters of Xerxes had become living reminders of the empire's cruelty, sacred and untouchable, yet entirely alone. Amethyst, now older and wiser, took it upon herself to protect what little remained of their dignity. She gathered the younger women, taught them to write, to remember, to endure. In the absence of freedom, knowledge became their rebellion. Outside, Persia changed. The great wars that had once defined the empire gave way to internal decay. Satraps grew bolder, provinces richer, and more independent. The once glorious Achaemenid army, the same that had marched across continents, became a tool of politics. Its loyalty bought with silver rather than pride. The grand palaces, from Susa to Babylon, still shimmered in the sun, but their foundations were hollow. The spirit that had united Persia under Cyrus and Darius was gone, buried beneath gold and gilt, and yet, through it all, the daughters of Xerxes survived unseen, unacknowledged, but unbroken. Their survival itself was an act of defiance. For generations, chroniclers and scholars would write of kings and battles, of empires that rose and fell, but few would mention the women who lived through their consequences. Amytas knew this, and so she began to preserve what little truth she could. Though forbidden by tradition, she dictated her memories to a loyal servant, stories of the harem, of her mother's vengeance, of her father's madness. She wanted the world to know that beneath the title King of Kings, there was a man, fragile, cruel, terrified, and that the price of his divinity was paid by those who shared his blood. Years passed, and Persia began to fade into myth. Artaxerxes ruled long and well, repairing some of what his father had destroyed. But he too was haunted by legacy. The memory of Xerxes lingered in every ritual, every ceremony, every whisper of rebellion. It was said that whenever Artaxerxes entered his father's old palace, the torches flickered as if the stones themselves remembered the screams of those who had suffered within. The empire endured, but its heart had turned to stone. For Amytas and her sisters, time became their only companion. They watched as generations changed around them, as new queens took their place, as the empire's focus shifted toward new horizons. But no one could erase the silence that Xerxes had left behind. His daughters lived out their days within the walls that had witnessed their pain, and when they finally died, there were no songs, no monuments, no inscriptions carved in their honor. Only the wind that passed through the ruined halls of Persepolis, whispering the stories they were never allowed to tell. Centuries later, when Alexander the Great marched into Persia and stood before the burning city, he looked upon the ruins of Xerxes' palaces, their once golden ceilings blackened with soot, their carved columns scarred by time. To the Greeks, this was victory. To history, it was irony. For in destroying what remained of Xerxes' empire, Alexander unknowingly fulfilled its final prophecy, that pride always ends in ashes. Among those ruins lay not just the remnants of a dynasty, but the ghosts of the women who had been silenced by it. Their voices, though lost to the world, became part of the stones, a silent testimony to the cost of empire. In time, the name Xerxes would become a legend, a symbol of arrogance, divine ambition, and cruelty. But legends have a way of distorting truth. The chronicles of Herodotus, the Greek historians, the later Persian poets, all would tell fragments of his story, each bending it to their purpose. Yet none could capture the full horror of what happened behind those gilded doors. None could tell how a father's paranoia turned love into punishment, how power turned family into sacrifice. That truth lived only in the unrecorded, in the silence between words. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all, that the daughters of Xerxes, who suffered for his sins, were denied even the mercy of remembrance. Their names faded, their faces forgotten, their existence reduced to footnotes. And yet, if one listens closely to the whispers of history, one can still hear them in the sigh of the desert wind, in the echo of marble ruins. The empire they once called home is gone, but their endurance remains. Unspoken, yet eternal. Xerxes was buried as a god, but remembered as a warning. His empire, once the greatest the world had ever known, became a lesson carved into time itself, that no throne, number crown, no army can protect a man from himself. The daughters he destroyed were not his weakness, they were his mirror, showing him what power had made of him. In breaking them, he broke the last piece of his own humanity, and as centuries turned to dust, one truth endured. Empires fall, not because of the enemies outside their walls, but because of the darkness festering within. Xerxes' reign proved that the mightiest kings can be undone by their own reflection, and that sometimes, the loudest echoes of history come not from the battlefield, but from the quiet suffering behind palace walls. So, when we remember Xerxes, the King of Kings, we must remember not just his wars, his palaces, or his golden throne, but the daughters whose tears outlasted his empire. Their silence, more powerful than his armies, still speaks to us across time, that even in the face of tyranny, endurance is its own form of victory. And that is the forgotten truth of Xerxes' harem, the truth the empire tried to bury, but that history could never fully silence. If this story moved you, and you want to uncover more of history's hidden shadows, tales of power, cruelty, and the human cost behind ancient empires, then make sure to subscribe to the channel, because here, we don't just tell history, we unearth the truths the past tried to hide.